we ready to go on?
Yeah.
We're good. Everybody please take their seats.
Yep. Absolutely.
So one of the things we will be talking about today is reserves and reserve studies. Starting with the new law that is going into effect and the changes that we recently had to that. But covering a lot of other topics. Also, all of us here are involved with Community Associations Institute. How many of you all are members, or your communities are members of CAI? Okay, so when we refer to CAI, we're referring to the Community Associations Institute. My name is Pete Miller. I'm an architect by background, but for the last 30 years I've done reserve studies as a full-time job. I'm also a 30-year volunteer with CAI. I served on their International Board of Trustees, and I've served on the Reserve Studies Committees and Reserve Studies Task Force starting in 1998, 2017, and most recently on the Task Force of Reserves Maintenance and Building Safety. So I'll be sharing that, a little bit of that with you today.
Thanks. My name is Alicia Menefee. I'm a senior property manager with First Service Residential. I'm also a volunteer with CAI, so I've served on the Marketing and Newsletter Committee. I've written articles for their journal, and currently I sit on their Legislative Monitoring Committee. So I'm happy to be a volunteer. I'm happy to work with those in this industry because I'm actually a career changer. I used to be a high school English teacher. Don't worry, there's not a pop quiz today, but I may put you in timeout if you act up, so we'll see. But you've done a great job. You all were engaged. I'm impressed you've made it thus far. HOAs and condos can be fun. It doesn't have to be toxic. It doesn't have to be hostile all the time. It's all about the mindset you bring into it. So hopefully we give you some solutions today that you can take with you and implement in your properties.
So one of the attorneys that I work with quite often in South Carolina is a man named Robert Lyle. And I think Robert said it best, that perhaps one of the greatest duties of the Board of Directors is to protect, preserve, and enhance the value of the homes in the community. So when we talk about reserves, what are reserves? Well, reserves are funds that are set aside for the eventual replacement, major repair, major maintenance of the common and limited common elements in the community. So it's the common and limited common elements of the condominium, co-op, homeowner association. So how do reserves protect property values? Well, first, it makes sure that we have money available on a timely basis so that things can get replaced. So the place doesn't start to look run down, so that you don't start losing the curb appeal. Second is it helps stabilize the normal assessments, how much your annual, quarterly, monthly dues are, monthly assessments are, so that we don't have to worry about special assessments, we don't have to worry about bank loans, unless something totally unforeseen happens. And third, it provides a way for each member of the community to pay their fair share towards the eventual replacement of these assets over time. So it's an equitable distribution of those costs over time. And this is not always an easy sell, folks. One, when you've got a community that you have a lot of real estate investors, they feel like putting money aside in reserves is kind of antithetical to their goal of maximizing the appreciation of the property. Second is when you have an older demographic. Let's be honest, there are plenty of older people that are in these communities that say, why am I putting aside money for a roof that's going to last another 10 years? So what we have to make them understand, both real estate investors and older residents, is a bit of a paradigm shift. We're not asking you to put aside money for a roof 10 years from now. We're asking you to set aside that money that life of that roof that you've used for the year or 3 years or however many years that you've lived under that roof and benefited from it.
Perfect. So when we get into the legal requirements impacting common interest communities, HB 107 really changed the game in Maryland, and this was a wake of the Florida condo collapse. Many states began passing legislation that impacted how reserve studies are done and who has to perform them. So the key things that you need to understand about HB 107 is all residential condominiums are required to comply, and any HOAs that have more than $10,000 in common elements must comply. The state lists out very specific requirements on who can perform these reserve studies. So they have to have performed so many already. They have to have certain credentials, backgrounds, and industry designations in order to perform it. So before, a lot of smaller communities were saying, well, we'll just eyeball it. and we can put the numbers together and we'll come up with our own funding plan. And HB 107 said, no, we really need you to rely on those industry professionals. And then finally, that said the association must budget for the reserve contribution. Note the word budget. It didn't say you had to put the money in the bank. It said you must budget, you must show it in your budget. So a lot of associations said, oh, okay. A lot of associations said, sure, we'll budget for it, but we're going to use the money that year and it's not going to end up in our bank account. And so the next slide will show us the states that, oh, we're going to change that. We realized we left something out, we need to amend it. So this year, HB 292 has been passed. It's on the governor's desk for signature. Once he signs it, it will be effective October 2025. The association first must identify the type of funding plan. So Pete is going to go into detail today. What are the different types of funding plans so that you can determine which one's right for you? The association must place into its bank account those allocated reserve funds at the end of the fiscal year. So it's no longer just budgeting for a reserve contribution, but maybe you use those monies for emergency repairs. Now they want to see that that money goes into the bank account. Well, what if you have emergency repairs? So you deposit the money December 31st, January 1st of the next year, you can use those money, right? The purpose of reserves is not to grow your bank account. The purpose of reserves is to get stuff done. So just know that just because you're contributing it doesn't mean you can't touch it. You still have to prepare. Unfortunately, fortunately, depending on how you look at it, HB 292 creates a request for financial hardship, where if your association, you are literally on the brink of bankruptcy, you can request financial hardship to extend it for 1 year. Please do not kick the can down the road, right? That's what leads to buildings collapsing. So to request this financial hardship, HB 292 lists out very specific steps the association must take in an open meeting to adopt it and show just cause as to why you feel you should be exempt from these requirements this year. The study must use an itemized list with very specific metrics. So before, you might get a reserve study and it just says, well, we're going to give you X amount of dollars for pet waste stations. Well, now HB 292 says we need to really see how many pet waste stations do you have and what is the price per unit. Do you have roofs? Well, how many square footage of roofs? Roads, what's the square footage of roads? So they want the reserve study itself to be very specific in identifying components, the units, and the cost of those components. And then, again, they're saying that recommended funding must be obtained within 5 years. The last thing that I really want to caution and urge you is don't forget your attorney. Your attorney has a lot of access to your association's background information and can check land records, especially if you are newly turned over from a developer, or if you've newly moved in and the board's turned over and you don't have all your governing documents, you don't have all your plats, you can't find your stormwater management plans, your attorney can fetch all that for you and can get all of that information to you and can also help you understand how to read those, because there's 3 things you need to be aware of. 1, what are your common elements, right? The things that we all maintain. 2, what are your limited common elements? The things that we all maintain, but maybe one person uses them, like a deck on a condo. And then 3, what are the unit components? And those things are very clearly defined in your governing documents. So it's never okay to say, well, I used to live in a condo, and that condo, well, the individual unit owner maintained their decks. Don't apply other associations' rules to yours. So it's in your articles of incorporation, your declaration, your covenants, your deed restrictions, all of those governing documents, that's going to define specific to your property. And your attorney is one of the best to help walk you through that process of understanding who maintains it, who repairs it, and who replaces it. Because sometimes you may have maintenance obligations, but it's not the association's responsibility to repair it, which impacts how you fund for reserves for it.
So Steve mentioned earlier that he had done several reserve studies, a level 1, a level 2, a level 3. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what those levels are. There's basically 5 tasks in a reserve study: developing the component inventory, including measuring everything, doing the on-site condition assessment so that you can tell what condition everything's in, estimating the life and replacement cost, and then developing the funding stacks. What condition are your reserves in? And then developing a funding plan. So in a level 1 full reserve study, something where you've never had a reserve study done, or it's been a long time since you had a reserve study done, you do a level full reserve study with all 5 of those. 3 to 5 years later, the national standards say 3 years, state law says 5 years, so 3 to 5 years later, you do a level 2 update. So you go through and repeat all those steps, except you already know what the inventory is. You've already got all those measurements, unless a lot of things have been added to the community. There's also what's called a level 3 update without a site visit, and that's basically a paper update. Let's say we did a reserve study last year and you just replaced all your roofs. We now know what the cost of the roofs are. We can make those changes, subtract a year off the remaining useful life of everything else. So that's a level 3 paper update. Doesn't require a site visit. And then the last is a level 4 preliminary. This is typically done for developers, so that when they're launching the community, they want to make sure it's on a sound financial foot. So the level 4 reserve study is typically something that's done for developers off of drawings. We thought this was a nice break in the information. So, Alicia, you want to talk about the different roles?
It is so important to know that whether you are self-managed or you work with a managing agent, not one person is going to drive this train. It's a group effort. And so it is so important that the board members themselves, each and every one of them, is engaged and involved in the reserve study process, attending the walkthroughs. That's so important that the board attends the walkthrough, because A, you get to learn a lot about your community that you may not have been paying attention to, but B, you may know things that the reserve specialist is not aware of.
For us as the reserve specialist, that walkthrough is particularly important, because that gives you time to show us where everything is. It also gives you time to point out things that we may not notice. And it also gives you an opportunity to talk to us about priorities.
Please involve your managing agent if you have one. So they are the ones that primarily are going to handle communication back and forth with the reserve companies. They're also going to be responsible for maintaining all of your association records. And so sometimes boards are very eager and they want to get projects done and they move forward and they sign contracts and send it off, and then a month later they tell the manager, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this. Please include your manager in all of that, because that helps them to be the oil that greases the engine and helps things move forward. And homeowners need to be engaged and involved in the process. They may already be asking questions at open meetings. Well, are our funds reserved appropriately? What does this mean? How does this legislation impact us? They may have asked questions during the budget adoption process if you had to increase assessments to fund reserves. So communicate with them, send an e-blast, or share it in a newsletter. You will see folks walking through the community performing an update study. Please feel free to say hi, right? Educate them on the process of we are bringing in an engineer to walk through and assess everything and share the results with them. In fact, it's HB 292 that requires you to share the results with them now. You must, at every annual meeting, go through your reserve study.
It's also not a bad idea when you're having the reserve study done, either during the process or once the reserve study's been finalized, to have a Zoom meeting and invite the homeowners. One, that gives them an opportunity to hear all the questions and answers in that process, but it also gives them an opportunity to buy into the process. And something that's important to consider is they're your future committee members, they're your future board members. So getting the homeowners involved early, as Alicia said, is a very good idea.
Perfect. So the life cycle of a study. A lot of times a board will come to me and say, okay, let's do a reserve study update next week. Not quite. Cool your jets, right? It takes a long time to get all of this information compiled out the door and scheduled. And so please think in your head, I may need 3 to 4 to 5 months time to lead up to the actual walkthrough and delivery of the study. So we're going to talk a little little bit about preparing for the study and who does what. We're going to talk a little bit about conducting the study and where do you go, what do you count, what do you look for. We'll spend definitely time on interpreting the study because the results change depending on what lens you look at. And then implementing and updating the study. It's not enough to just get a reserve study done and go, okay, we're done, we did it. No, fix your roofs, fix your roads, fix your infrastructure. We have the results, now we need to implement it. So the very first step is an RFP creation, request for proposal. You want to make sure that you are reaching out to state qualified specialists who can conduct studies. And you're more than welcome to Google. That's absolutely a great resource to find business partners. But you are also welcome to use CAI's free vendor directory, and that will list who is qualified to perform reserve studies in the state of Maryland. The manager oftentimes is responsible for sending out that RFP. If you're self-managed, you can ask your attorney to help you with that, and you can also ask your attorney to help you analyze the contract so that they're apples to apples. A lot of times you don't lean on your attorney enough and they can help. So the bidder selection, you're more than welcome to interview them. I will tell you, I have worked with some reserve specialists who do not want boards to attend the walkthrough because the engineer doesn't want to be distracted, and I don't like that. I want my boards there, present and engaged. So that's one of the things that we will ask when we interview the bidders.
Let me jump in as somebody that's done the walkthrough with the communities, with the boards. One of the issues that we find is that we're walking around answering questions at the same time we should be looking at everything. So it's important that the board or representatives of the community participate in that walkthrough. The way that I particularly like to do it is to go out with the board, have them point out everything that they think needs to be pointed out, and then give me the rest of the afternoon to walk around and a phone number I can call if I have a question. So there's a medium range for you.
The quality of your reserve study is going to be as good as the quality of the information that you give to this man. So I have a reserve study update that's going to occur in about 2 weeks, a mile down the road on the Menefee River, and I started this process 3 months ago, where we reached out, we got proposals, we're just doing an update with a site visit. I know that the person who's coming to do the site inspection is the same person that did it 4 years ago, but it's my job as the managing agent to give him all of the things that we've done in the past 4 years. So every proposal, every contract, every invoice I've ever paid, for every single reserve project, I had to compile and give to him. And it was a 200-page document. As a managing agent, that's my job, right? If you are self-managed, please make sure you're keeping your records because each time you update, you want to give them the exact specifications. You fixed your roads, was it a 2-inch overlay or was it a 3-inch? Did you seal coat? When? So they want to be able to see not just, oh yeah, we did some road work last year. It's not enough for them to update your reserve study. They want to know specifics. Do your roof shingles have a 30-year warranty or a lifetime warranty? What kind of roof shingles do you use? So they're going to want to see the actual proposal. So that document organization is critical and key every time you update your reserve study. Inclusions and exclusions. This can sometimes get spicy. So a lot of times boards will say, Alicia, we have a lot of trees. And we have a lot of trees that add to the value of our property, right? You enter and it's just this long stretch road of beautiful trees. And if those trees were to ever to come down, it would be tens of thousands of dollars to replace them. It would impact our property values. And we don't have money set aside for that. Can we put that in our reserve study? Yeah, you can. You can include things in the reserve study if it's outside of the norm. Like it doesn't have to be a roof, it doesn't have to be siding, it doesn't have to be infrastructure. If you know that you're going to have a major repair coming up down the line, a big replacement of an item that you might not traditionally include, you can put that in your reserve study to help you save for it. Can you exclude things like, well, my roads look good, let's take them out? No. Otherwise, that liability falls on your shoulders. So the discussion of inclusions and exclusions is one that you're going to want to have with your managing agent and reserve study. Because a lot of associations say, well, traditionally landscaping isn't included. Stormwater management may be, but the aesthetic curb appeal of trees may not.
And one of the reasons that you need to discuss this is that it's not just the reserves and the reserve study that is being considered. The reserve study also has to consider the Internal Revenue Service guidelines on reserves. What things are considered replacement versus what things are considered maintenance and operations. Because the IRS guidelines allow you to put legitimate capital expenditures, those replacements or major repairs, but they don't allow you to include anything that would be considered maintenance. And there's not a real defined line between the two. So it's one of the reasons why that discussion is particularly important.
A lot of boards will ask questions about operating thresholds. So most of the time you get your reserve study back in draft form, and there will be a line item here that says any expense less than $5,000 is treated as an operating expense. And they go, what does that mean? I don't understand. And I'll say, well, what it's saying is you don't have to pull from your reserve fund if you have a replacement for anything less than $5,000.
Or less than 1,000
Or 10, or whatever's best for you. So that number can be adjusted. If you're always carrying a lot of money in your surplus operating account, you have a contingency every year, then you can protect your reserves by paying for it out of operating. Always pay for it out of operating if you can afford it to protect your reserves. But they will put that number in there and they can adjust that for you to match what's right for your community.
Right, and we discussed the other day on the phone, it's not a bad idea for the board to pass a resolution in a board meeting, or in an open meeting, so that it's recorded in the minutes. It says anything that has a life expectancy of 3 years or more and a cost of more than X, $1,000 or $5,000. So anything that has a life expectancy of 3 years or more or cost X or more, that's a capital reserve item. That goes in that column. Anything that has a life expectancy of less than 3 years and a cost of less than X, we're going to assume is going to be treated as maintenance and operations. For you all, it's left pocket, right pocket. You're paying for it one way or the other. But there has to be some consistency from board to board, from year to year, on what column these things fall into. We want to make sure it's in one or the other. We want to make sure it's not in both. We want to make sure it's not left out completely.
If your fiscal year aligns with the calendar year, let's go through what that looks like for us, right? January, February, March, April, May. June, life's easy peasy. We're just rolling along. We've got plenty of money. August hits and your manager or your accountant or whomever on the board does finances says, okay, it's August, 6-month financials are in. It's time for us to make our budget for next year. Oh, by the way, we need to update our reserve study because we have to adopt our budget in an open meeting. And the budget has to be adopted in the open meeting and notice provided 30 days prior to the meeting, and the budget has to be adopted 30 days prior to the start of the fiscal year. So budgets are adopted in October, November. If you're adopting budgets in December, you're late. Well, starting the reserve study process in August, starting the RFP is too late. It's too late for you to have numbers to update your budget for the upcoming year. So you really want to do that January, February. That's the time to start. If you want to have those numbers to update your budget for the following year. Now, I'm not saying you go, well, Alicia said it's too late for us to do it this year, so let's just put it off till next year. That's not what I'm saying. You can still do it this year. You just may need to revise your budget for next year. Conducting the study. So what is he and his team going to do? They're going to work with you based on your governing documents to identify the components, whether it's common or limited common, and they're going to quantify. They're going to count them. Right? How many do you have? They're going to estimate replacement costs, and they're going to determine the normal life expectancy. So I'm going to say, normally I have a pet waste station and it's going to last me 30 years before it rusts out. They're going to look at that and go, it doesn't look like it's in good shape. I think you only have 7 years left. So you're going to get a chart that has all of your common elements, how long they should last, and how much time they think you have left. And then they're going to tell you how much you need to save so that when the bottom does rust out, I have money to replace it. You get then what's called your draft review. And that's the point where everybody goes, oh my God, we gotta raise assessments $10 million. Slow down, it's okay. We can talk. It's called a draft study. because that's what it is. It's a draft. It's a starting point. A lot of boards go, $10 million for roofs. I had a guy down the street, he said he'd do it for $4 million. Okay, well, let's go talk to that guy, right? So Pete can definitely talk about the relationship that he will build with local vendors, that if you have and look at the cost of replacement for something, and you have always used a contractor who's qualified, licensed, insured, please make sure, you can start that amendment and adjustment process of your reserve study based on local people that serve your community.
Let me emphasize something before we go any further on the process. And that is, if you don't take away anything else in this seminar, take away this. The reserve study is not an independent third-party audit. It is going to be one of the most intensive exchange of information that you probably will do as part of the association's life. We want to get as much information from you all as we can, not just in the draft process, but what's going to be in the component inventory. Where can we get prices for roofing? Is there a contractor that you've worked with that has been particularly successful in your community? Or a paver, or siding, or pool people, whatever. So we want to get as much information from you all as possible because it's your reserve study. It needs to reflect what you all are trying to accomplish. And especially in the review process, it's very, very important that you spend the time and go through and question everything in that report. We don't look at that as criticism. My other colleagues in other companies don't look at it as criticism. We look at it as input and inquiry. And that's important to make sure that this is honed to the accuracy that needs to be to reflect what the goals and aspirations of the community are.
I had a property in Arrow Cove, and they had recently turned over from the developer. It was a homeowner elected board. They had their first reserve study done, and it came back and they said, well, you need to start putting money aside for your stormwater management system. And they said, that's an awful lot of money, and there's only 12 of us. And that's a lot. I mean, you can only spread it out between 12 different ways. And so they went to different professional engineers whose job solely was to install stormwater management systems, and they said, what do you think the remaining useful life is on this newly installed stormwater management system? Because a reserve study only looks at 30 years. It's a 30-year snapshot. If something lasts beyond 30 years, it doesn't go on the study. And so 3 out of the 3 engineers that they met with said, we think you're 40 years out of it. So they went back after the draft, they said, take the stormwater out, we'll talk about it in 10 years. And a major change in how much they had to fund. But they took that extra step. They asked questions. So please understand, Pete's absolutely correct. The draft is the starting point of a very big conversation because you should be in the weeds and the details of all of it. So you go through the draft, back and forth with Pete. A lot of times there'll be a virtual meeting where you go through your questions, and then you get your final revision. What do I do with it? Well, number 1, it must be included in your resale package. Please notify new owners moving into your community, the condition of reserves, and provide a copy of the reserve study to them. Number 2, please provide it to all of your current unit owners. Whether you have a portal or a website or a management company with an office, please give them a copy. Talk about it at your budget meeting. Talk about it at your owner annual. Go through it with residents. A lot of times, the reserve specialist will attend that meeting as well and answer questions with residents. And then you want to determine your funding plan, right? Before we really didn't have to do that. We kind of took the engineer's recommendation, but now HB 292 says the board must choose the funding plan that's right for them. Well, what are the different funding plans? So let's hop into that.
So when we talk about the reserve study, there's actually 4 different ways of calculating reserves. And we're going to talk about these last 2, the cash flow, or what's called the reporting method, and the component method, sometimes called the full funding method. So these are the 2 that are primarily used. There's also the statutory method, which means if the law requires or if some entity requires that you put a certain percentage or a certain amount in your reserves. There's also the threshold cash flow. And we'll give you an example of that threshold cash flow in just 1 second. Here's a mathematical model. I'll try to make this as easy as possible to understand because it's a lot of information. But we've got 4 projects. Each project costs $1,000. We're going to do 1 project per year, so they're staggered. But they get repeated every 4 years. So we've got painting, seal coating, plumbing, and retaining wall. I just picked these out so that we can make a differentiation. And let's assume that there's a zero balance and a zero threshold. Threshold simply means when we calculate the cash flow, it's not a zero-based cash flow. We don't say how much money do we have to put in and never drop below zero. We say how much money do I have to put in and never drop below a predetermined minimum threshold. It's a contingency. The IRS doesn't allow us to put a contingency in the inventory. We can't say 10% or 5% contingency. So we build into the mathematical model, give me your starting balance, how much money do you have to put in each year and not drop below a predetermined minimum balance, which is something that's discussed with the board. What's the appropriate amount? That gets into a lot more detail than I want to go into now. But cash flow method. We're using actually a threshold cash flow method. But it makes sure that we have adequate funds each year. Okay? Here's the important distinction. When we look at the component method or the full funding method, it's making sure that we have adequate funding for each individual item. The distinction here is you can't borrow from the painting to pay for the paving or borrow from the seal coat to pay for the retaining wall. In the component method or full funding method, each of those has to be its own legitimate line item budget.
If you're not sure which method your association currently uses, whether it's component or cash pooled, here's a good example. Most of my associations have one operating account that we pay bills out of, and then we have one reserve account that we pay reserve bills out of. And then we can get complicated where I do have MMAs and CDs, and we'll talk about them in a minute, but it's just really one reserve account. And then I have some associations that have 7 reserve accounts, and it's called reserve rows, reserve roofs, reserve pool. And we can only pay pool reserve expense bills out of that reserve account. That's the component method. We are specifically earmarking those funds so that they can't commingle in one general account.
So most of our clients, as will become apparent in just a minute, use the cash flow method or the threshold cash flow. So here we've got year one, we have to pay for the painting, and we need $12,000 in year one to pay for the painting, right? So we put in $12,000. In year two, we need $12,000 to pay for the paving. Year three, $12,000 to pay for the plumbing. Year four, the retaining wall. You see where I'm going with this. Each year we put in $12,000. We needed $48,000 to fund these projects over a 4-year period, and we put in $48,000. Now you're thinking, this is so simple, why is he boring us to death with this stuff? Let's look at exactly the same model, but using the component method, where you have to fully fund each individual item by the time it needs to be replaced. So here's the component method. We need $12,000 for painting in year one. So we have to put $12,000 in for painting. We're also putting $6,000 in the first 2 years for the paving, because we need $12,000 for that in year two. But you see, each time that we pay for one of these things, we then go back to $3,000 per year because we've got the full 4 years. Anyway, in year three, we're putting $4,000 in each of those 3 years for the plumbing, and then we've got $3,000 a year in each year for the 4 years for the retaining walls. What's happened here is we needed $48,000, but because of the mathematical model, we've had to put in 66. So we're overfunding by 37%. That's because of that particular model, and that's why most clients that we have use the cash flow method. The only reason we still have a component method is that California was the first state to pass a law that required reserves, and that law says you have to fully fund each individual component according to its rate of depreciation. Basically, it says you have to use the component method, and they've never been able to change that law in California because they're worried that once they do that, everybody else will jump into the law and try to pass their own amendments to it. So, as my colleagues from California and Washington and Oregon and Hawaii have kind of migrated east like the coyotes, we've gotten stuck with their component method as being the second method that's used in the reserve calculations.
Sure. One of the things to take into account when you get your final study back is the reserve specialist is going to give you 2 calculations, and one is CPI, interest, the rate of interest increase on goods and materials, and the other is interest, right? The interest that you're earning on investments. So we're going to talk pretty briefly about CPI and PPI. So CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and we know that it's going to increase every year, forever and ever, till the end of time. Unfortunately, that's the truth of it. So we take that into account when they're creating reserve studies, is that the cost of these things are going to increase. But there's also PPI, and that's the producer price index. And that we're looking at labor, and we're looking at material costs, and the big fun exciting word that we're hearing in the news right now is tariffs. That is going to impact how much you have to contribute if they remain in effect long term. After COVID, we saw massive increases in the cost of goods and materials.
And we'll see that in just 1 second.
So this is a very helpful research. So CAI is a nonprofit, it's a membership organization. We also have a research branch, and all they do is solely they perform research in the industry. Steve, I don't know where he went, he showed a best practice image on his slideshow that talked about the best practices of stormwater management. We offer free resources on the website that's created by the Foundation for Community Research, and they also put out white papers. So they listed out, just for our own awareness, how much the percentage increases had occurred. This came out December 31st, 2024. So everybody will get these slides when they're done, when you go home. So you're more than welcome to access this. But it's helpful to know that if usually, Pete, you'd say for your interest, you're looking at 3%?
Well, actually, we're looking at, on the interest side, less than 3%. On the inflation side, we're looking at, right now, we're using about 6.
Okay.
Let me jump in here and point something out. When we're looking at the producer price index, I don't know if this is showing up at all. It's not. We're looking at the second line down, the PPI construction materials. The 6-month trend is flat. The change from a year ago was minus 72%. The 5-year average was 7.8%. The 10-year average was 4.64%. Why is the 5-year average higher than the 10-year average? Well, this is a newsletter that I get every month. Let me show you what's happened here. We're looking at the consumer price index, which over the last 5 years has gone up 22.8%. We're looking at final demand construction, which over the last 5 years has gone up 37.1%. But I want you to look specifically at 2021 and 2022. In those 2 years, we had 12.2 and 18.5% inflation. Now, inflation has slowed, but inflation has not come down. So what this means is that if you did your reserve study 5 years ago, you should expect an increase of about 37%. But we need to drill down even a little bit further than that, because if we look at specific materials, what if we look at diesel fuel? What's diesel fuel going up in the last 5 years? 57.9%, very top right-hand corner. If we look at asphalt, well, asphalt's gone up quite a bit. Concrete pipe has gone up 65%. Ready-mix concrete, 37.9, almost 38%. So if we drill down and we look at these specific products, and we look at the nature of the materials in your community, well, we can see petrochemical products, roofing products have gone up astronomically. Any petrochemical product in your community, we're talking about asphalt paving, asphalt spindles, vinyl siding, painting, wallpaper, plastic pipe. I mean, the amount of petrochemical products we have in our communities is startling. So what we have to look at is what are the materials that you've used in your, or that have been used in the construction of your community, and that's going to give us some idea of what that inflation rate is going to be. Right now, inflation, if we look at the final demand on construction, it's been about 7.25% per year over the last 5 years. Right now, we're using a 6% inflation rate. We're being a little bit optimistic. We don't try to be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, but we know that it can't sustain itself at the high inflation rate that it's been at. So we're bringing that down a little bit.
Perfect. I think next is how to make money. Oh, almost. Okay, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They used to have a rolling requirement that they will look at your budget and want to see at least 10% of your operating account going into your reserves annually. Now they will look at not just your budget, but they will ask for a copy of your reserve study. So they want to see that a reserve study has been performed within the past 3 years. Well, how often do you have to have it performed in Maryland? Every 5, right? So it's a little bit more challenging in that these state and or federal organizations are putting requirements on condos.
Well, the question is, why are we worried about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae? Well, if you're a homeowner association, you don't have to be. But back before the construction and lending downturn in 2006 to 2010 and 2011, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, through the Federal Housing Finance Administration, were involved in about 7% of all residential real estate transactions, 7%. When the bank stopped loaning money in 2006 and 2007, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae were the only game in town. All of a sudden, they were involved in 70 to 75% of all residential real estate transactions. They used to, before the construction loan issue, they used to issue spot approvals. If you wanted to sell your condominium, they'd look at some paperwork and say, your condominium unit is approved for Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, batch financing. Now the entire condominium has to be pre-approved. And they've got very, very stringent guidelines, one of which is you have to have a reserve study that was done within the last 3 years. And it has to show that you're adequately funding reserves. Sorry.
So you may have homeowners start to contact you if you're living in a condo and say, wait a minute, I just lost a potential buyer. And that will impact your property values. So it is something to be cognizant of and to talk with your membership about. This is my favorite slide, right? This is the not doom and gloom slide. All right, so you only can assess your owners what they can afford to pay. That's the truth of it. HB 107 gave boards total power to raise assessments to whatever level needed to fund reserves without a vote of the membership, right? That's a lot of power. But you can't take money from people if they don't have money. So how do you get there, right? What are some other fiscally responsible strategies your board should be engaging in? Number one, do not ever keep more than $250,000 in a bank account, right? Do not exceed the FDIC limit. So you should be looking at money market accounts and you should be looking at CDs. A lot of associations will ladder their CDs to come due when they believe that a component is ready for replacement. Now, are the CD rates that great right now? No, but it's better than nothing, right? So talk to your management companies. If they go, oh yeah, we keep your money in a 1% earning reserve account. No, no, 4 to 5, right? That's what I'm seeing right now for my clients. So advocate, do what you need, make sure that you're earning interest on the money that you do have. But consider taxable implications. So if you are earning a significant amount of interest, the IRS is going to tax you on that interest, right? Because normally for HOAs and condos, your assessment income is not taxable or taxed at a lower rate. But if you start making a whole lot of moolah, they want a piece of that. So please make sure you're talking with your accountant to set aside the appropriate amount for when you file state and federal. Evergreen assessment. So most residents have had to pay a capital contribution when they purchase their home the very first time, right? If you want to live here in this beautiful community under construction, you have to pay $500 and that goes to the association. And then that's it. Some associations require on a resale that next buyer to pay a capital contribution, and that's called evergreen income. Because you will always be selling homes, and people will always want to buy in.
The community that I'm part of on the Eastern Shore has the evergreen assessments. Every time a property sells, there's a capital contribution.
If you do not, it will require a vote of your membership to pass, because it would be amending your declaration or your bylaws. But if you do, consider as a board adopting a fiscal policy during an open meeting that says we are going to earmark all of our capital contributions to go directly into our reserve fund. Now, you don't know how many units are going to sell a year, but that's more money than you would have had before because you were just putting it in operating, right? So think about how much money have we seen. Resales come in cycles, right? Every 20 years, you see a huge boom in new ownership moving in, new ownership moving out. And then please have really big conversations on, do we need to take a loan for this or do we want to do a special assessment? And Pete can talk a little bit about this because it may impact your property values depending on what you do.
Right. Keep in mind the whole reason we're doing reserve studies is what? To protect property values. But if we're going to have a precipitous increase in the assessments, that's going to be antithetical to protecting property values. So perhaps it may be wiser to go for a loan and spread that cost out over a 3, 5, 7, in some cases 10-year term, than it is to have a special assessment. The problem that I've found over the last 30 years of special assessments is that you will almost always find somebody who can't afford to pay it. So that triggers a delinquency, At some point, that delinquency may trigger a foreclosure. That foreclosure triggers a sub-market sale, and that sub-market sale then can become a real estate comp for all the other similar units in your community. So a special assessment, in fact, can damage property values. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, if you're financing something, some major replacement through a loan, they don't deduct that. They don't consider that a disqualification, but they do look at how many special assessments have you had. So my feeling is loans are always better than special assessments.
Perfect. All right, communicating with residents. Easy peasy, do it. Do it often, do it daily. It's like taking your vitamins. Talk about it. Talk about it in every single meeting that you ever have. Talk about reserves. Talk about how much you have. Please make sure that your financials are available for your membership to review. You want to review that during your budget season when you look at your reserve study. You want to review your reserve study during your annual. Make sure it's available for your membership and resale packages and for review. You want to be as transparent as possible. And the most critical thing, please don't just collect the money, use it, spend it. I love spending money. I just spent $2 million to replace a bulkhead on the Menefee River, right? I'm now officially a barge wrangler because we had to bring in barges to dredge stuff up. That was an adventure. So yeah, spend it to fix things. That's the point. This is a printout, a screenshot of a portion of a reserve study. They will tell you year by year what you need to do. They give you a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, and it will list out how much they think you need to spend and their opinion of what are the items that they think are going to be due. We print this out, we take it with us on our walk. I walk the property with my board, and we go through this and we look, do we need to do this year? Do we want to defer it to next year?
That's an important point. Let me interrupt for a second. When you look at your reserve study, you look at those calendar pages, or you look at that spreadsheet, and it shows you all the things that have to be, shows you all the things that are projected to be replaced in 2025, for instance. If these things don't need to be replaced, don't replace it. This is not a work list. This is instead, this is something that says, this is the year that's going to be prudent to have the funds available for these particular items. But if the items don't need to be replaced, your reserve study is not telling you to replace it. Your reserve study is telling you to make sure you have the money for it, because this is probably when it's going to occur. But as Alicia said, when you walk through and you have that reserve study, you're looking at the next couple of years, make sure that you're marking down, if there are things that can be deferred, or things lasting longer than you thought they were, or things expiring sooner than you thought they were, that we have to move them up to this year or next year or whatever.
Well, good job. You did it. That was the last slide. We made it. Questions? Here come the hands. You get the mic now. These are all for you.
We rushed through that kind of quick because we knew we were short on time. Certainly.
To amplify what you said, Pete, is that when we're doing our budget process, in our large communities, 2,700 homes divided up into parcels, we review what is coming due, like curb replacement. We ask the representative of that particular parcel, do you actually have to do the work? Go out and take a look at it, see if it's replaced. The money's in there, so you can replace it if it's necessary. It doesn't mean anything you have to. So just to amplify what you said, it's not a work list.
Right. No, thank you very much. It's helpful. Yes, ma'am.
We have 90 SCBDs in Arundel County, and my understanding is we are not required to have a reserve study. Is that correct?
Special benefits tax.
You know, I think that's a legal question, and I'm going to defer. I can't answer that. I honestly don't know based on the changes to the law,
Right.
because it's not addressed specifically in the law. So it might be a great question to ask your attorney. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can we revisit your statement? You're talking about we needed the square footage of the road, and then you went into a statement that said funding must be obtained within 5 years. Explain that. So if you have your reserve study and the gazebo needs to be replaced in year 3 and the dock within year 7 or 8, and another item, is it 5 years from the date that those are supposed to?
If it's your first reserve study, what the law calls your initial reserve study,
Yes.
you have up to 3 years the way the law sits now. There was an amendment to stretch that to 5 years. So if we were saying you had to put $100,000 into your reserve, and this was your first reserve study, you have up to 3 years in which to get to that amount, to get to that annual funding.
So I understand your question, because it's a good question. So you're saying, what is this 5-year time frame? So they're saying you have to develop a funding plan, and that funding plan is exactly how much you put aside every year so that you're eventually saving up and that you always have the money for what you need when you're gonna need it. Not all of the money right now. No, that's not what fully funded means. Fully funded means you have the money when you need it. So they're looking at 30 years, and it almost looks like a roller coaster when you look at your reserve study, where it's like you save and you save and you save, and then holy smokes, we gotta fix the pool. And your money goes down, and you save and you save and you save. So they're saying 5 years to hit the required amounts based on the funding plan that you select. Not to be fully funded, but if they're saying you're gonna go with the component method and you wanna do the baseline, which is the most riskiest but the least amount, you have 5 years to hit what they're saying should be in your bank account. And they will have a chart on there that says by 2024, this amount should be in your bank account, 25, this amount should be in your bank account, 26, this should be in your bank account. And that's how the reserve study breaks it down. So they tell you in your reserve study how much you should have in reserves at the end of each fiscal year. So you have 5 years to hit that mark. Yes.
Steve, do you have a question?
Yeah, Alicia, you said several times now, 30 years. Is that a new requirement of the law? It could be 40 years.
It's a requirement of the National Reserve Study Standards. The National Reserve Study Standards used to say that the reserve study had to cover at least 20 years. It's now been extended to say it has to cover at least 30 years. State law, I do not believe, addresses that. Let's take a question over here.
So just a comment, our community, Oyster Harbor, is an SCBD. We've never had a reserve study. We did one last year. It's one of the best things we ever did.
Yep, same here.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So we're talking about choosing between a loan and a special assessment. How do you take a loan without there being a special assessment? How do you pay the loan back?
Well, rather than saying you're going to special assess everybody $25,000 all at one time, what you do is take out a loan to pay for whatever that near-term expenditure is, to spread that term out, and that way they can spread out that financing. Sorry, that wasn't clear. Yes?
On the 30 versus 40 years, so if we wanted to include like our stormwater management system, could we put in 30 years worth of
That's a
the
great
funding
question.
for that?
Did everybody hear that? So,
Sorry.
talking about 30 years versus 40 years, if they wanted to put in a stormwater management system that's supposed to last 40 years, if they wanted to put that in the reserve study, could they put in 30 years worth? That's one strategy to do it, you put in 3/4 of the cost by the end of your 30 years, yes. You can also do a 40-year reserve study. I mean,
Well, I think
you're really looking at the 30 years, but they can go out as far as you want them to go. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we're a very small community, and the law says $10,000 in common elements or limited common elements. How do I find the value of our common elements?
You know, most reserve study companies, if you call them and say, here's what we have, and we don't think that we qualify to have a reserve study, they'll give you an honest answer, and they'll send you an email that says, yeah, we agree that you're below that $10,000. It's almost one of those catch-22 things. You don't know whether it's below $10,000 unless you do a reserve study, and if it is, you didn't have to do the reserve study in the first place. So you know, Alicia and Steve Miller have been gracious about giving me plugs about reserve studies. I have a lot of colleagues in the Arundel County area that also do reserve studies. Go to CAI's website, you can find a list of us. So it's not just Miller+Dodson that does them, but if you want to give our office a call with that question, we'll be glad to get back to you and respond.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
And thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
This is all very interesting, and I've lived in a condominium for 60 years, so I know what you're talking about. But my question here is, you mentioned a lot about you can ask your attorney, you can ask your attorney. Your attorney will charge you. You have a volunteer board coming to these meetings, and you expect them to be able to do a study, inflation versus cost of living or something like that.
Right.
Be making those decisions, which really have to be made by an accountant if you want a decent study. How long do you, I mean, condominiums just have more and more things, more municipal functions are now being assigned to condominiums. People have trouble getting people to serve on the board because they're volunteers, they don't have that knowledge. How long do you think that this system, as it's running, is sustainable?
Well, that's it for me, I gotta get
If you all have another couple hours, we can, no, I mean, it's a great question, and philosophically, you know, we should have had a law in place from the very beginning that says you have to put money into a reserve fund. But now we've got these older condominiums that they can't afford to play catch-up. What are they gonna do? There's now discussions about what do they call it, disenfranchising the condominium, so that you dissolve the condominium, sell the property. I mean, I've got a client now that, in their request for a reserve study, said we want a 30-year reserve study, or we want a 6-year reserve study, because we don't think that we're gonna keep this building more than the next 6 years, so we need to know how much we need to put in our budget. But give us a 30-year reserve study just in case. And they're thinking about selling the property, tearing it down, and rebuilding. So you're right, how sustainable is it? No way to tell. I mean, smarter people than me would be able to probably give you a better answer. Do we have another question over here? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
That $10,000 threshold, I assume that's just the improvements, that's not the value of the land?
Right. That's just any physical assets that need to be replaced. If it's $10,000 or less, you don't have to do a reserve study.
Just, nobody here from the state, but our board thought that this law was the best thing since sliced bread, because when we went out to the community, the letters all said this was the law, we got no pushback. So we were very grateful for it, and it solved a huge problem for us.
Well, good. I'm glad it's working for you. There are plenty of other communities that are saying this is going to force us into foreclosure. But you have to break the cycle someplace. I mean, I've got a co-op in downtown Baltimore that's got 80 roofs that all need to be replaced, and they've got about $20,000 in a reserve fund. It's a co-op. It's supposed to be a less costly housing model. And they're looking at huge special assessments that nobody there can afford. We're looking to the state to see if the state will start some kind of grant program for low-income communities to be able to comply with the reserve study law. But we haven't gotten very far with that yet.
Last year, the state did pass legislation that allowed counties to create programs to help fund association repairs. So and it's one of those feel-good bills, right? Like, go for it, counties, give them money, but the state's not going to give you any money. So if that's something you're interested in, reach out to your Anne Arundel County legislators to say, would you create this grant program to help us fund reserves? We don't want to request a financial hardship. We don't want to kick the can. Can you help us?
We've now gone beyond our allotted time. We're going to stick around here if you all want to ask us questions. We don't want to keep you any longer.
Can I ask one while he walks down real quick?
Sure.
Is there a penalty on this latest legislation yet? Because there wasn't one.
There's no enforcement built into the bill, intentionally.
There's no.
But that doesn't mean that there's no penalties. It means that it's a civil penalty. If somebody from the community calls up and said, I just got hit with a special assessment because my dumb board never did a reserve study, I want the Attorney General's office to look into this, that's what would trigger that type of enforcement. But there's no automatic enforcement built into the bill.
And no enforcement doesn't mean no liability. So the liability remains. But
Yeah, just because there's no enforcement doesn't mean the board doesn't have a fiduciary duty to do things properly. Last question.
With all the transition of management company to management company and sometimes reserve specialists coming in at different levels, like maybe there's been a level 1 full funding study, but then another reserve specialist takes over at level 2 or 3. I think there's a lot of bad information exchanging, and one thing that would really cut through it is if the reserve specialists at all phases are actually checking the declaration, because I've seen things that shouldn't be in the reserve studies and the opposite as well. So from your perspective, what's the best way to guard against that, and what's your practice?
I'll answer that. I agree with you. I think there has to be some consistency, but here's the problem. Is I've got a lot of architects and engineers and reserve specialists around the country that are doing the reserve studies. They're not attorneys. They're not qualified to interpret your governing documents. So if we're going through and looking at your governing documents saying this should be included but this shouldn't, then we're really exceeding our bounds. So what we look to is for the board to tell us. Now, I've got some cases where the board says, look, all the windows in this condominium belong to the condominium. But we're not going to fund that through reserves because we don't want to be putting that much money aside. In 10 years, we plan on paying off the elevator loan. We're going to take out a window loan. So the elevators weren't in the reserve study to begin with because of the choice of the condominium. The windows aren't in the reserve study because they've got a different funding model. That's all legitimate. But if we went through and said, this is exactly what your governing documents said need to be in your reserve study, then we'd be ignoring the input from the board, from the community. So we'll convolute the answer, but.
And it costs a lot more.
All right. Thank you all very much.
All right, thank you. All right, there never seems to be enough time for these things. Last year we did a half-day session, and then people told me, you could keep me all day. We kept me all day, and that still wasn't enough time. So Matt, I think we need a 2-day session next year. I was going to ask everyone to give me your greatest takeaway, but we're at 5 o'clock, so you can just do that for your survey, which is already in your inbox. So please complete the survey. A lot of you have come to me and said you're interested in connecting with each other. So in the survey, there's an opportunity for you to leave your name and email. And if you want to connect to each other, will do that for you. But I don't want to do that without your permission. So if you want to give me permission to connect you all, please complete the survey and put your name and email in the survey. And I'll be happy to do that. And I'll conclude with Happy Mother's Day. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.